The humiliation was complete. Marcus Williams stood there, dressed in his simple jeans and hoodie, as the restaurant manager's voice cut through the dinner crowd like a knife. "Sir, you need to leave, now. We don't serve your kind here." The entire dining room fell silent. Every eye was on him. Every whisper, every stare, every judgment. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 1 hour, Marcus would own this place, and everything was about to change. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. Chicago's Gold Coast district, where million-dollar condos kiss the sky and exclusive restaurants charge more for dinner than most people make in a week. This is where Le Bernardin sits, a French restaurant so exclusive, so pretentious, that they literally have a dress code posted on solid gold plaques. Marcus Williams had been watching this place for months. Not as a customer, you understand. As a businessman, as the CEO of Williams Entertainment Group, a company worth $200 million that owned hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues across the Midwest. But today he wasn't wearing his $1,000 suits. Today he was just Marcus, a black man in jeans wanting to grab dinner after visiting his nephew's basketball game. Here's what Marcus didn't know when he walked through those glass doors. The manager, Robert Fitzgerald, had been having the worst month of his life. 3 health code violations, 2 bad reviews in the Tribune, and orders from ownership to maintain the establishment's reputation. In Robert's twisted mind, that meant one thing: keep out anyone who didn't fit the image. Marcus pushed open the door, the sound of classical music and clinking wine glasses washing over him. He approached the hostess stand with a simple request. "Table for 1, please." The young hostess, Sarah, barely looked up from her reservation book. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, her tone already shifting. "No, but I see empty tables," Marcus replied, gesturing toward the half-empty dining room. That's when Robert appeared, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Excuse me, sir?" Robert's voice carried that particular tone. You know the one. The tone that says you don't belong here without saying it directly. "I'm going to have to ask you about our dress code." Marcus looked down at his clean jeans, his Nike hoodie, his spotless sneakers. "I'm dressed fine," he said calmly. "This is business casual." But Robert wasn't interested in logic. "Sir, we have standards here. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the McDonald's down the street?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. But this wasn't his first encounter with racism. At 42 years old, he'd learned to keep his composure. "I have money to spend here," Marcus said quietly. "I just want to eat." What happened next would change everything. But first, you need to understand what Marcus was really thinking in that moment. See, Marcus Williams had built his fortune by studying people, by understanding human nature, and standing there in that restaurant, watching Robert's eyes scan him from head to toe with disgust, Marcus saw something familiar. The same look he'd gotten 20 years ago when he was actually poor, when he was working 3 jobs to put himself through Northwestern, when people like Robert made him feel invisible. But this wasn't 20 years ago. And Marcus wasn't that struggling student anymore. He was a man who'd just signed a $50 million acquisition deal that morning, a man whose company employed over 3,000 people, a man who'd been quietly buying up properties in this very neighborhood for the past 6 months. "Look," Robert said, his voice getting louder, attracting attention from nearby tables. "We have a certain clientele here, a certain atmosphere we maintain. You understand?" Marcus felt the familiar fire building in his chest. The same fire that had driven him to succeed, to prove every doubter wrong, to build an empire from nothing. But he also felt something else: curiosity. Because as Robert continued his discriminatory tirade, Marcus noticed something interesting. The restaurant was struggling. Half-empty tables on a Friday night, outdated decor, staff that looked overworked and underpaid. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Robert announced, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Several diners stopped eating. Phones came out. Someone was recording. This is where the story gets interesting. Because Marcus had a choice. He could reveal who he was. Pull out his Platinum American Express black card. Show Robert the Forbes article that called him the Midwest's most influential under-40 CEO. But instead, Marcus did something else. Something that would teach everyone in that restaurant a lesson they'd never forget. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'll leave. But let me ask you something, Robert." He'd read the manager's name tag. "What's your last name?" "Fitzgerald," Robert replied, puffing up with pride. "My family has been in the hospitality business for generations," Marcus nodded slowly. "Fitzgerald. I'll remember that." And with that, he walked out. But he didn't go home. He didn't retreat. He made a phone call. "David, it's Marcus. Remember that restaurant deal we discussed? Le Bernardin on Rush Street?" "Yeah, that's the one. I want to accelerate the timeline. How fast can we close?" The voice on the other end was his lawyer, David Chen. "If you're willing to pay cash and waive inspections, we could have papers signed within the hour." "Do it." Now here's what Robert didn't know, what none of them knew. Le Bernardin had been hemorrhaging money for months. The owner, Jonathan Mitchell, was desperate to sell. He'd been in quiet negotiations with Williams Entertainment Group for weeks. But Marcus had been taking his time, doing due diligence. That all just changed, because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad, it's getting even. And Marcus Williams was about to show Robert Fitzgerald exactly what real power looked like. 37 minutes. That's how long it took Marcus Williams to buy Le Bernardin. 37 minutes to turn from victim to owner. From the man who wasn't good enough to eat there to the man who controlled whether it stayed open. While Robert was inside, probably bragging to his staff about how he'd handled that situation, Marcus was in his lawyer's office, signing acquisition papers. $12.3 million cash, no financing, no contingencies. Just a man with the resources to buy his way out of humiliation and into justice. But here's the beautiful irony of this story. Marcus didn't buy the restaurant out of spite. He bought it because he saw opportunity. Because while Robert saw a black man in casual clothes as a threat to his standards, Marcus saw a struggling business that needed leadership. Vision. Someone who understood that success comes from serving people, not excluding them. The call came to Jonathan Mitchell at 9:47 p.m. "Mr. Mitchell, this is David Chen, representing Williams Entertainment Group. We're prepared to close on Le Bernardin tonight. Cash offer? Full asking price." Jonathan couldn't believe it. He'd been trying to sell for 8 months. Now suddenly a buyer was willing to pay full price with no negotiations? "There's just one condition," David continued. "Mr. Williams wants to make the ownership transfer tonight. He'll be arriving at the restaurant in 10 minutes. Back inside Le Bernardin, Robert was having what he thought was the best night of his career. He'd protected his restaurant from an undesirable element. He was already planning how he'd tell this story to other managers, how he'd position himself as the defender of fine dining standards. The dinner crowd was thinning out. Just a few tables of regulars. The kind of customers who made Robert feel important because they knew his name, tipped well, and never challenged his authority. That's when the door opened. Marcus walked in, but this time he wasn't alone. David Chen walked beside him, briefcase in hand. Behind them, Jonathan Mitchell, the actual owner of Le Bernardin, looking nervous but determined. Robert looked up from the reservation podium, his face immediately hardening. "Sir, I thought I made it clear—" "Robert," Jonathan's voice cut through the air like ice. "We need to talk. Now here's where this story gets really good. Because what happened next wasn't just about Marcus getting his revenge. It was about a moment of truth that would ripple through that restaurant, that neighborhood, that entire community. Jonathan Mitchell stood in the center of his dining room. Well, his former dining room, and made an announcement that nobody, especially Robert, saw coming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan Mitchell's voice carried across the nearly empty dining room, "I need to make an announcement. As of 9:52 p.m. tonight, Le Bernardin has been sold." Robert's face went white. The remaining staff froze. The few customers left looked up from their desserts. "Sensing drama, the new owner," Jonathan continued, "is Mr. Marcus Williams of Williams Entertainment Group." He gestured toward Marcus, who stood calmly, hands clasped behind his back. "Effective immediately, you could have heard a pin drop." Robert's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The same man he'd humiliated and thrown out an hour ago was now his boss? Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm and professional. "Thank you, Jonathan." "Robert, isn't it?" He looked directly at the manager who'd refused him service. "I believe we need to have a conversation about your customer service policies." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The man who wasn't good enough to eat at Le Bernardin now owned every table, every chair, every glass of wine in the place. But here's what makes Marcus Williams extraordinary. What happened next wasn't about humiliation or revenge. It was about transformation. "Robert," Marcus said, his voice firm but not cruel. "In the next 5 minutes, you're going to have a choice. You can learn from tonight, acknowledge what went wrong, and commit to treating every customer with dignity and respect. Or you can find employment elsewhere. What's it going to be?" Robert stammered, his authority crumbling. I was just... "We have standards." "Standards?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Let me tell you about standards. Standards mean treating people with respect, regardless of what they're wearing. Standards mean judging customers by their character, not their color. Standards mean understanding that a person's worth isn't determined by their appearance." The restaurant was completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had gathered to watch this unprecedented scene unfold. "I built a $200 million company by serving people," Marcus continued. "All people. Because I learned early that success comes from inclusion, not exclusion. From opening doors, not slamming them shut." Sarah, the young hostess, stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, I want to apologize. I should have spoken up. I should have done something." Marcus turned to her with a gentle smile. "Sarah, you just did something. You acknowledged the problem. That's where change begins." Over the next 20 minutes, Marcus laid out his vision for the new Le Bernardin, a place where excellent food and service were available to anyone who walked through the door, where staff were trained not just in hospitality, but in humanity. Robert, faced with the choice between growth and termination, chose growth. It wasn't easy. It required him to confront every prejudice he'd held, every assumption he'd made. But under Marcus's leadership, he began to change. 6 months later, Le Bernardin became the most successful restaurant in the Gold Coast district. Not because Marcus lowered the standards, but because he raised them. The food got better, the service got warmer, and the customer base grew to reflect the real Chicago, diverse, vibrant, and hungry for both great food and great treatment. Robert Fitzgerald, the man who once refused service to a black customer, became one of Marcus's most dedicated managers. He learned that true hospitality means making everyone feel welcome, valued, and respected. The lesson? Sometimes the person you underestimate, the person you judge by their appearance, the person you think doesn't belong, sometimes that person owns the whole damn building. Marcus Williams didn't just buy a restaurant that night. He bought a lesson in human dignity that changed an entire establishment and everyone who worked there. Because that's what real power looks like. Not the power to exclude, but the power to transform. Not the power to tear down, but the power to build up. And sometimes the best way to fight discrimination isn't with anger. It's with action.